right, so welcome everyone to the webinar, What's Bugging Your Trees? Insect and Fungal Pests in Southeastern Urban Landscapes. My name's Holly Campbell and I'll be the host for the webinar today. I'm an Extension Associate with Southern Regional Extension Forestry, working in urban forestry and wildland fire education and outreach. As part of the Cooperative Extension System, our office develops educational products and resources to support forestry and natural resource programs across the Southern region, like this webinar today. Our website is sref.info if you would like to learn more about what we do. Our presenter today is Dr. David Coyle from Clemson University. Before formally introducing Dr. Coyle, I'll provide a short introduction. First, I would like to thank the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension for co-hosting our Zoom webinar today. Today's webinar is part of a larger series entitled Understanding Urban and Community Forest, an Extension webinar series. The series was planned by Southern Regional Extension Forestry with input from several cooperative extension, urban, and community forestry experts in the Southern region. This slide includes the planning partners for the series. Their input on key topics and speakers for the series was essential. The series is designed for educators, specifically for cooperative extension county educators. However, each webinar in the series may also be relevant to natural resource managers, other types of educators, arborists, urban foresters, and more. So regardless of your work focus, all are welcome to join today's webinar and any webinars in the series. The goal of the series, which includes 12 webinars in all, is two-part. One, to increase extension educators' knowledge of research-based urban and community forestry information, and two, to provide educational resources that support delivery of that information to the public. Ultimately, the series aims to increase Extension's role in urban and community forestry education and outreach. We're hoping that the series will reach not only Extension personnel focused on horticulture, urban forestry, and natural resources, but also Extension involved in family and consumer sciences and other focus areas where appropriate. This slide includes some of the other webinars in the series. The webinar that's outlined, obviously, is our webinar today, and the ones preceding that have been archived. And as you see, we have one more webinar in the series, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with the cooperative extension, the Smith-Lever Act formalized extension in 1914, establishing the U.S. Department of Agriculture's partnership with land-grant universities to apply research and provide non-formal agricultural education. Congress created the extension system to address rural agricultural issues. Today, however, extension has expanded its focus to match changes in society and economics, providing research-based education in areas like family and consumer sciences, forestry and natural resources, youth education, and so much more. So popular extension programs that most of you are probably familiar with include 4-H and the Master Gardener program. Extension is a trusted information resource in communities, and for those of you who are not part of Extension, we wanted you to know we make great partners to help disseminate information to the public. So please keep Extension in mind as a potential partner on your next urban and community forestry project. Though several extension educators provide urban and community forestry information to their communities and counties, the number of educators in this area are few. So our hope is that these webinars will help increase their role in urban and community forestry education and outreach. Now, there are likely participants listening to this webinar who are unfamiliar with a few of the many benefits of urban trees and forests. Urban trees and forests help clean our water and air. They reduce hot summer temperatures, wind speed, and reduce noise. They've been shown to reduce crime and provide a sense of place and connection, beauty, and food. They also reduce our energy bills and increase our property value. And as Dr. Coyle will share momentarily, urban trees continue to provide these benefits when we know how to properly care for them. So I would now like to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Coyle. Dr. Coyle is an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University in South Carolina. His extension forestry program focuses on forest and tree health and invasive species across the Southeast. Prior to Clemson, Dave ran the Southern Regional Extension Forestry, Forest Health, and Invasive Species Program, which provided hands-on training, electronic resources, and other services pertaining to management of native and invasive forest insects, plants, and diseases to forestry professionals throughout the southeastern U.S. Dave completed his BA in biology at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, his MS in entomology and forestry at Iowa State University, and his PhD in entomology at the University of Wisconsin. Following his PhD, he worked as a postdoctoral research associate at the UGA Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. He serves on the board of directors for the North American Invasive Species Management Association and is co-director of ProForest, a group at the University of Florida working to better manage invasive species. All right, Dr. Coyle, are you ready?
I am ready, Holly.
Great. I will stop sharing my screen and you can begin sharing yours.
Let's see, share. All right, are we seeing? Are we good?
We are good.
All right, thanks, Holly. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. We're going to talk about bugs and fungus in your urban trees. And Holly mentioned earlier that there's one more webinar after me next time. I'm going to purposely avoid a lot of the foliar pathogen issues because I think Dr. Woodward's going to handle a lot of those. So we'll do some of the stem stuff, but avoid some of the foliar stuff so there's not a lot of overlap. So for obvious reasons, the urban environment is a very unique one. It's much different than anything we have in natural systems, and trees planted in urban environments have a whole lot of things they've got to deal with on a regular basis. You've got precipitation, be that rain, be that ice. There's flooding that can happen. We're seeing this all over the Carolinas right now as a result of Florence. There's a lot of wind damage that can happen as well. There's pollution to consider. With this comes all sorts of pests, insect, fungal, mammal, bird, all sorts of stuff. Humans are an often overlooked issue in urban tree care. And I was at spoke with the Clemson City Forester a couple years ago, Tony Tidwell, and he said one of the biggest problems they have in downtown Clemson being a town with a rather large university and a rather successful football program, is that after football games, you tend to get a lot of 18 to 22-year-old people, fairly rambunctious, and they do a lot of what he calls guerrilla pruning, where they will grab a branch and pull down and sort of hang on it. So you get a lot of extra wounds on trees that you wouldn't normally have in a natural setting. And then, of course, there's the whole temperature issue and the climate change and global change and the temperature. Now, I want to touch on that a little bit. We know that urban areas tend to be heat generating things. And if you look at a surface thermal map, this one's in Raleigh by Adam Dale and Steve Frank, you can see there are very hot spots scattered out throughout the whole city. And now just because a spot is very hot does not mean there's going to not be a tree plant on there. So in a lot of cases, we've got trees planted, like that picture we just showed you, in the middle of impervious surfaces. So they've got a much different environmental condition than would a tree in someone's yard. And what does all this mean? Well, when you look at the effect of temperature on trees, there's a lot of studies that have happened. One thing we know is that as the nights become warmer, there's going to be more water loss from leaves. Okay, we know this. We also know that when it's hot, photosynthesis decreases. So a tree's ability to make energy is not as good. And there's plenty of stuff to show that when it's hot, a tree can't make and store as much reserve energy. So what you end up having is this perpetually stressed tree, right? It's never quite refilling its water reserves. It's not making as much food. It's not storing as much food. So you've got a perpetually stressed tree. And this is really important in urban environments, especially. Moving on to some of the critter stuff, Insect Bio 101, insects are ectotherms. That means as it gets warmer outside, as the outside temperature increases, the insect body temperature increases. So it's a very linear relationship there. So what does that mean? That means with a warmer body temperature, they're going to grow faster and they're going to grow bigger. And just as an example, here's an old study, and we'll use a very hungry caterpillar as our little model here. They all start at the same size. You've got different temperatures here. This top graph shows a daytime temperature of 66 Fahrenheit and a nighttime of 61. And this bottom one is a daytime temp of 77, nighttime of 72. So in the top graph, eventually that little caterpillar will go from this size to this size, and it will take, this long, 56 days. As it gets warmer, it will get bigger, and it will get bigger faster than it would at that cooler temperature. And then as it gets warmer still, you're going to get an even bigger hungry little caterpillar at an even faster rate than you would the other two. So increasing temperature benefits a lot of the pest insect species we have, especially in urban areas. Fungi is essentially the same way, and I read through this paper so you don't have to. Each one of these graphs shows a particular fungus and its growth curve. So as it gets warmer across the bottom, going left to right, the growth going up to down, and your general pattern is this. So what that pattern means is that if it's too cold, down here on the lower left-hand side, you don't get a lot of growth. As it gets too hot, way over here where the line takes a steep downturn, things die. But there's a happy medium in the middle where as it gets very warm, you see very rapid fungal growth. So what does this mean for the trees? Well, it means a few things. It means most urban trees are going to be stressed both physically and physiologically pretty much all the time. That's just sort of the going rate with being in an urban area. It also means that most tree pests only impact stressed trees. Now, there are some exceptions to this, but in the entomological and fungal world, this is the general case. Most of these tree pests we talk about need a stressed tree to get going. So that tells us that the urban tree environment is this perfect storm of stress factors. We've got trees that are stressed by multiple things, sometimes multiple things at the same time. We've got insects and fungi that are attracted to stressed trees. You've got the perfect storm. So let's talk about some of these more common ones we see across the southeastern US. There's several caterpillars. We'll start with the forest tent caterpillar. This caterpillar, even though it's called the forest tent caterpillar, does not make a tent. So no tent for this one. Native to the US and North America, found all over, one generation a year. They eat so many different things, it's easier to tell people what they don't eat, which is red maple, sycamore, and conifers. Pretty much everything else is something they will eat or at least try to eat. They've got what I call a standard Lepidopteran life cycle. They overwinter as this little egg mass here on the branch. The eggs hatch and caterpillars come out and begin feeding and grow larger over the summer. They make cocoons and then eventually they come out as an adult, in this case moth, mate, and lay eggs. Now these outbreaks of forest tent caterpillars are cyclical. They sort of come and they sort of go. They will often not kill a tree, but these repeated defoliations are definitely not good for the tree and they can act as a stressor. You can see some of these trees here. It's the middle of summer and they are completely devoid of leaves. Another thing that insect outbreaks, especially caterpillar outbreaks, can do is they can be a huge nuisance. In this case, you can see all these cocoons all along this house and the siding of the house. The caterpillars can get on the roads, and of course, if you've ever squished a caterpillar, you know it's mostly full of goo. You get a lot of those on the roads, and roads can get slippery too. So they can become a big nuisance pest as well as stripping trees. So the eastern tent caterpillar does make a tent. So that is one that is correctly named. This is one that you commonly see early in the spring. It makes these tents right in the branch crotches. Again, it also has an egg mass that overwinters. It's got a caterpillar that then completes development and turns into a moth. Now these two are very commonly confused, but there's a couple good ways. There's a good way to figure out who's who. The eastern tent caterpillar has a white line going across the back all along the caterpillar. The forest tent caterpillar has what looks like white boot prints going along its back. So pretend a little tiny person stepped in white paint and walked all along that caterpillar. That's what it looks like. Now, depending on your perspective, it might look like a happy penguin too. It just depends on how you're seeing that thing. But the take-home message, the eastern tent caterpillar has a white line. The forest tent caterpillar has boots or penguins. Now, tent caterpillar management, it's essentially the same for each of these. One option is to simply do nothing. Another option, natural enemies will take care of these populations. You can treat some of these things with insecticide, but keep in mind if the caterpillars are inside the tent, those contact insecticides are not going to work. Single tree controls, you can do branding where you put some plastic or some wrap around the tree and put a very sticky substance on there that will catch those caterpillars as they're moving up and down the trees. If you see egg masses, you can remove those and destroy them. And you can treat a tree with BT formulation, some other chemical controls. For eastern tent caterpillars that build that web, the easiest thing to do is take a stick and break open that web. And that web, all that web is doing is protecting those caterpillars from natural enemies. If you break open that web, those natural enemies are going to get in there. The birds will get in there, the wasps will get in there, and they will probably take care of things. So if you've got a web of any sort like that on your tree, and this includes some of the webworms, go ahead and just break those open, and that should take care of it. So the fall cankerworm, these are also known as the loopers. There's one generation a year, also native to North America. They have a lot of hosts as well. It's very common with some of these common defoliators. They eat almost everything. And in some areas, they can be a big nuisance, and they can be a big nuisance for a long time. We've seen some of these areas for decades have had some of these cankerworm problems. Again, very standard life cycle. The one difference is the female in this case is wingless. So as she hatches, or as she emerges from her pupa, she simply crawls up the tree, attracts the male, they mate, and then she lays her eggs back on that same tree. That is one of the reasons that sticky bands are very effective both for the larvae and for the adults for cankerworms, because those female moths are just going to crawl straight up the tree. Again, there's plenty of different things you can spray to take care of them, but there's also a very healthy natural enemy component kind of all over the Southeast, and that tends to help as well. Now, cankerworms are really interesting. There's a really nice study about the spillover effect, and that just says that trees that are normally not eaten, or non-host trees, are going to be eaten more in the presence of a preferred host tree. Now, this was done by Steve Frank at NC State. What they looked at was dogwood trees. So over here on this graph, you've got basically the amount of leaf area eaten going from bottom to top. And we've got some treatments over here we'll talk about. So in each case, Dr. Frank looked at how much defoliation from cankerworms happened on dogwood trees. So this flower represents dogwood. This flower right here on the very left-hand side, that's just a dogwood tree out in the middle of nowhere, okay? So they had fairly low damage. This next one represents a dogwood underneath a larger tree that was not really a host species for cankerworm. In this case, it was a pine. So if you've got a dogwood under a pine, it's basically getting the same amount of defoliation as a dogwood out in the open. Now, when you go to a dogwood underneath something like a willow oak, which is a known preferred host for the cankerworm, look at how much defoliation happened on that dogwood in that case. It was much, 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 much greater amounts. So what this is saying is there were so many cankerworms on these preferred willow oak trees that they basically spilled over onto the dogwood and caused an increased amount of defoliation there too. So for those of you that have influence in how cities plan their urban tree canopy, this is definitely something to consider when you're thinking about the layering of trees, is what will attack insects both high and low. The gypsy moth is one of our most well-known defoliators. It was native to Europe. It was brought to Medford, Mass. In 1868 on purpose by Dr. Trouvelot. His big idea was he was going to breed it with silk moths, and that was because silk moths are picky eaters. The gypsy moth feeds on almost everything woody. The problem is the gypsy moth and the silk moth are not even in the same family. They may look alike, but they cannot mate. So that is the moral of the story, is just because things look alike does not mean you should try to mate them. Well, some larvae escaped, and then he went back to France and kind of left us with this. And, we'll give the USDA credit. They tried as hard as they could back in the day to control things. Clearly, this was before OSHA standards kicked in, but it didn't work. Larvae got out, and the gypsy moth is very common across much of the Northeast and, almost the Eastern North America at this point. The gypsy moth life stages, they start as an egg mass here, and these little caterpillars hatch. They will come out and they will feed. You've got rows of red spots, 6 rows of red spots and 5 rows of blue spots. And they make sort of a scraggly looking little pupa, and then the adult females are white, the males are brown. Managing gypsy moths, there's several different ways. There's a virus that's been made into a formulation that can be sprayed called Gyp-Check. Larvae that are impacted by this virus have this characteristic upside down V shape. You'll see them hanging on the tree. There's a natural fungus that's out there, Entomophaga, that will take care of a lot of the populations. There's mating disruption technologies that have been developed also, and this is admittedly better for larger areas. So if there's a large urban park in the middle of a city, that type of thing, this is where this is going to work a lot better. What this basically does is take the chemical that the female gives out. So the females give out a chemical that attracts males to them that says, hey, it's time to mate. All these little packets around this penny are containing that same chemical. So when you drop them all over an area, the males can't find the females, and then the mating doesn't happen. There's just too much of the odor everywhere. And there's plenty of chemical controls as well. There's all sorts of things you can spray. Again, BT is one of the more common ones. There's a very large natural enemy component too, as far as gypsy moth control. So the emerald ash borer is one of our, probably the most notorious urban insect pests we've had in a long time. Best we could tell, it's killed millions of trees worth billions of dollars. It's really tough to put a true number on it. Here's your current emerald ash borer range over much of the eastern North America. A new one as of last week was up here in Nova Scotia. It has been found right outside Halifax there as well. A lot of green little beetles come into diagnostic labs, but there is only one EAB, so if you deal with this, I'm sure you've seen things like this before, but it's a very small beetle, but it is extremely bright green. The life cycle, these adults will emerge in springtime. They can survive for a week or two without food, but then generally they'll get out there and they'll start nibbling on the leaves. They don't do a lot of damage as an adult. It just nibbles on the leaves and eats a little bit of leaf tissue. They'll put some eggs in the crevices of bark, and then those are going to hatch in 1 to 2 weeks. The larvae are what do the main damage. They start feeding after they hatch and then continue feeding through the spring, summer, fall, and early winter. They are consuming the phloem on that tree, and they are what's cutting off that tree's ability to survive. You can have a lot of galleries on a single tree to where there's almost no phloem tissue left. In the end, they're going to pupate right on the inner bark there, and then they will come out again the next year. What to look for EAB? You've got a declining, thinning crown, and this can be tricky because under bad drought stress or some of these other stressors, it can also look like a declining and thinning crown. But the important thing to remember is this insect only hits things in the genus Fraxinus. So ash trees, different ash trees. There's been some reports of the white Chinese fringe tree getting hit. Couple reports of that, and I think maybe an olive it developed in, but whether or not that's going to actually hit those in the natural areas, I think it was found in fringe tree one time, but by and large you are looking at ash, the ash resource here. After a year or so, you're going to see this epicormic sprouting happening on the trees, and this is the tree's last gasp chance at survival, and it almost never works. At this point, this tree is basically toast, the walking dead, so to speak. And up close inspection, you're going to see some of these cracks on the bark. You'll also see a perfectly D-shaped exit hole. So think D for Dave. That's what I always tell people, D for Dave. And the adults chew those exit holes that shaped like that every time. And then if you're able to peel the bark or see some of that bark, you're going to see those winding galleries. And a lot of times, this bark will split open enough to where you can see the galleries going back and forth underneath that split bark. Woodpeckers are a dead giveaway too. You've got a lot of woodpecker activity in these emerald ash borer trees because there's a lot of larvae in there, and they are trying to eat those larvae. So we have documented increases in the bird populations following the emerald ash borer wave, so that is definitely a thing. And then another thing those birds do in part is they contribute to what we call ash blonding. So they are going after those larvae so fast and so furious, they're flaking chunks of that bark off, exposing sort of the inner, it's basically the middle of the bark. So the outside has been, the outside has been chipped off. This is kind of the inside. You can see woodpecker holes all over this stuff. And as you're driving by, even at 50 miles an hour, you can pick out these lightly colored splotchy ash tree trunks fairly easily. When do you look for EAB? There's a couple different ways. APHIS puts out a degree day model. We figured out how long it takes them to develop. I find this National Phenology Network a fairly good one. They update it here. There's a website that I think Holly will push out to folks in the chat box. But that will give you a map every week of your current situation. This was for May, so this sort of tells you on this day in May this year, the 15th, everywhere in green, you've got emerald ash borer adults flying. Everywhere in yellow means get ready. They're coming quick. And that will move as the year goes. Management-wise, there's a fairly extensive monitoring program going on across the eastern U.S. and even into some of the western states as well. At this point, that's what we're doing, is we're monitoring, trying to figure out where is it, and that way different municipalities can plan. Should they be infested, they can know how to handle the resource and their money. There's a large public campaign to get people to not move that firewood. I know it's tempting. If a tree dies in the yard, you've got all this firewood and you might want to take it to hunting camp or fishing camp or wherever you might go in camping, for recreation. But it's very important not to take that wood outside of where it died. I believe they say within 5 miles is okay, but those larvae can live in there for a year, even more. And so if you're taking a freshly dead piece of wood somewhere, you could be unwittingly or unknowingly transporting not just emerald ash borer, but all sorts of invasive insects. You could be transporting those to a whole nother place and starting a new infestation. So that's hence the buy it where you burn it program. We try to get people to get their firewood from a local vendor. And if you're going to save ash trees, which we can, if EAB has done one thing, it has given us a lot of information and improved our techniques in how to save trees with different chemicals. You can save an ash tree. The key is to do it early. Now, if you get a tree with less than 10% defoliation, like over here on the left, that's a very good candidate to be saved. You can start injecting that and that tree will probably live. Even up to 30% crown loss, you can save that tree. But once you get over 30%, and here we have a 50% loss, you got a much, much, much lower chance of saving that tree with some of these chemicals. The key with emerald ash borer is when that emerald ash borer is known to be about 15 miles away, that's when you want to start preventative treatments. It's not recommended to start them before that, but within 15 miles it is recommended. EAB adults on their own can travel about, it seems like about 12 miles a year is kind of the front advancing rate. So give yourself a 15, 20 mile window if you want to be a little more conservative. And like I mentioned, we've got a lot of good ways we can control emerald ash borer. All of these are going to depend on the financial and logistical limitations you're in, what sort of environment you're in, what are your cost windows and barriers, what resources you have available. I do think that the MMF and benzoate formulations are probably the most effective, and you're getting 2 to 3 years of control from one particular injection in that case. And it can be a little sticker shockish to do some of these treatments. Let's say it costs $300 to treat your tree one time. Well, that sounds like a lot of money, but then the question is, what is the value of a tree? And we try to get people to remember that healthy trees have value. They're not just there doing nothing, they've got a value. And there's a tree benefit calculator that's been made. And this is a really useful tool to demonstrate to people what a tree is worth. Okay, and it puts numbers on things that are hard to put numbers on. Now let's give an example here in Oklahoma. Let's say we have a 20-inch white ash in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, down there in the southeast corner. You can put that in this tree benefits calculator. You can go in there and you can enter, white ash, 20-inch DBH, and it will spit you out a value, broken down pie chart style. So the property value, you can say it's saving you this much per year, or it's worth this much per year. Stormwater, air quality, electricity savings, all of this has a value. So this tree calculator puts those values together, and then you find out, hey, this tree is worth $166 a year to me. Well, if we just talked about a $300 treatment that's going to be good for up to 3 years, that's $100 a year. And it makes, using those numbers and these numbers, it makes sense to treat that tree and keep it alive versus remove and replace. You're going to be hard pressed to find a situation where it's not worthwhile treating a tree, especially a high value one, because of the benefits they give you financially.
Hey, Dave. Dave,
Yes, Holly.
before you move on, I just wanted to remind everyone that I have put some links into the chat box that related to EAB, what Dave just talked about. So I'm also going to add some other links in the chat box. So if you see that flashing, click on that and you'll be able to access that link that he's referencing in his slides. Okay, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Holly. All right, we'll move on to bark beetles now. We've got a lot of these in the southeastern U.S. There's a lot of these across the country and the continent. Most of these are going to attack stressed trees. Again, we talked about the stressed tree thing. Our obvious exception is the southern pine beetle down here. They feed on the phloem. I like to think of phloem as the sleeve of life. It's around the outside of the tree, and it's what brings the nutrients to and fro. The feeding from bark beetles is going to girdle or consume that phloem, and then trees are going to die from lack of nutrition. We have 7 native bark beetles in the southeastern U.S. On the left-hand side here, we've got the 4 ips, and then we've got these 2 big ones, turpentine beetles, and then this fella right here, the southern pine beetle, Dendroctonus frontalis. This is our main tree killer, especially in natural areas. We've got the southern pine beetle is kind of what I call your standard bark beetle. They try to go into a tree and the tree fights back using pitch. It tries to pitch them out with these little pitch tubes, but eventually the beetles are going to overwhelm these trees. You're going to see each one of these little white blobs is a tube of sap that the tree tried to put out to protect itself, but in almost every case, the beetle got in. They're going to get in there, make their galleries. Their larvae are going to feed on the phloem, and then you can see here the gallery pattern. It sort of waves in an S shape, S for southern. It waves around, they feed on that phloem, and then after they've developed and pupated, they come out. You just have these emergence holes. You notice there's no pitch on emergence holes because the tree is no longer fighting back. This is just the beetle leaving, and here's a great shot of that southern pine beetle. These things are only about 3 millimeters long, basically half the length of a grain of rice. They're quite small little beetles. This is what we think of traditionally. This is a traditionally natural area damaging agent where you've got national forests or large contiguous chunks of production forest land. This is sort of your standard southern pine beetle damage, but they will hit a tree in an urban area just as well. This is from down in Florida. You can see this is on the edge of Daytona, and here's a large southern pine beetle patch. Southern pine beetles attack pine trees. They don't particularly care if that tree is in the middle of the woods or in the middle of a neighborhood. If that tree has the right characteristics, and if an outbreak of southern pine beetles happens, they will mow through trees regardless of what situation they're in. Ips bark beetles are very similar. These are about the same size. They make a little different gallery pattern. They generally are shaped like a Y or an H or an I, and they've got little spikes on the back of their bodies there. The entomological joke is that ips are a pain in the butt, because if you were to sit on one, you would get poked in the butt. Same thing, ips are normally more of a forest or natural area problem, but especially under times of drought, you will see ips creep into urban and suburban areas all the time. This is a shot from Stone Mountain in Georgia, just outside Atlanta. Lots of ips trees dying there. This is on the road 316 going to Atlanta, and they were just, trees dying all over the place. Beetles don't particularly care where a tree is. If it's stressed enough, they will get in there and they will kill that tree. Now, ambrosia beetles are similar to bark beetles. They're about the same size. There's a little more morphological variation. Some are shaped quite interestingly. There's many, many different kinds, and most of these in the southeastern native, but we do have plenty of non-natives. Ambrosia beetles almost exclusively attack stressed trees. It doesn't matter where that tree is. If it's stressed, a stressed tree gives out certain chemicals. It gives out ethanol. Ambrosia beetles can sense that, and they will find it and attack it. Now, while the bark beetles fed on the phloem, fed on the sleeve of life, and girdled that tree, ambrosia beetles do not eat the tree itself. The adults will bore in there and basically make a home, but in that home, they culture fungi, and they make these fungal gardens, which is what the larvae eat. So the ambrosia beetles are going to bore directly into that tree, into the wood part. And then this is your telltale ambrosia beetle sign. You can call them toothpicks, you can call them noodles, you can call them frass tubes. Each one of these things coming out of this tree is from one adult ambrosia beetle, boring in there, making a little tunnel, culturing these fungal spores that she carries on her body. her larvae will hatch from the eggs, and then they will feed on that fungus in there, and then they will eventually come out. It is very rare for an ambrosia beetle to be the primary killing agent for a tree. We'll talk about one that is, but most of them are the thing that finishes a tree off. I will also mention this is the thing that we get a lot of calls on because it's one of these very obvious insect things that happens when a tree dies. So a lot of times homeowners will see their tree dying, they will walk out, they will see noodles, and they will think whatever made these noodles killed my tree. Probably not accurate. A lot of times the tree was weak or even in the process of death beforehand. The ambrosia beetles just sensed that and came out and finished things off. The one particular ambrosia beetle that seems to be quite a problem, at least down here in the south in urban areas, is the black twig borer. Now, this is a tiny, tiny little thing, about 1 millimeter or so long. It's got an extremely wide host range, and they're very tiny. And what they are going to do is they are going to make damage on the end of branches. It's what we call flagging. So you see these dead branches on the end of this tree. It's a mostly aesthetic problem. So if you're in a natural area, this probably doesn't matter a whole lot, but if it's your favorite magnolia tree in your front yard, it's going to look a bit shoddy. For established plants, it is rarely a problem. You can tell people if you want to just prune those off, that'll work. If you've got new plantings or something that was transplanted and you have high enough populations, it could be an issue. That is pretty rare. Damage, as I mentioned, hand pruning works great. A lot of times if you look on that tree right below where it has started to die, you can see a little tiny hole. And that is where that beetle went in and bored up towards the dead part. So you just come down a couple inches below that, snip that off the pruner, and then dispose of that material, and you've taken care of that particular beetle. Once the beetle gets into that tree, it's really tough to use chemical controls because the beetle is protected by the tree and it's inside the wood, so it's not going to be feeding on the phloem or anything. So it's tough to use chemical control. The good news is the attacks tend to be closer to the ground. That is just sort of what this graph shows. As the lower we are here, the closer it is to the ground, and that's where these bars are bigger. So there's more attacks. So if you are hand pruning, you can probably get most of them, within your 5 to 6 foot reach or so. So now we'll talk about the one ambrosia beetle that does kill live trees, and that's the red bay ambrosia beetle. And this is the one that carries laurel wilt. These are both native to Asia. To the best of our knowledge, it's killed 300 to 500 million trees so far, and it's still moving. So this is a fairly sad situation. There's a good website on Laurel Wilt called laurelwiltresearch.com. It has a standard ambrosia beetle life cycle. The adult senses a tree in the family Lauraceae attacks. You can see again, here's your pitch tubes. The beetle larvae feed on the fungus in there. That fungus discolors the wood. So when you see a tree that's been killed by laurel wilt, there's always a staining that happens inside there. And this is just a cross section. You can see these little galleries with the fungus cut in there. This is your ambrosia beetle damage. The hosts for laurel wilt is anything in the family Lauraceae. So red bay, swamp bay, silk bay. These are very common trees in the Gulf Coast. Camphor trees. Sassafras is one of the trees that creeps up into the middle of the country, into the central hardwood region. So we're concerned that, there's a potential for this disease to travel farther than the southeast because it's got a host there. And some of these things are fairly rare as well. So there's some conservation issues with laurel wilt also. Here's our current disease distribution. This is where it was found right around Savannah back in '02. And now you can see it spread over much of the Gulf or of the southeastern coast. Florida is completely covered. Every county has it. And we've got some of these outlier populations here: Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas. Here's another situation. The beetle did not fly from Mississippi all the way over here. So this was very, very likely spread by some sort of firewood or some sort of wood product that came over. Most of these Lauraceae trees are not commercially used in this part of the world, so the odds are that this was a firewood started spot is pretty high. Managing laurel wilt is there's not a lot of options. You can take what you have cut, what has been killed, and chip it. There's no physical protection that works. If you find it early and you have a large Lauraceae tree, some trees, especially in Florida, you've got a lot of red bays in the front yard. Those can be protected with fungicides. In theory, contact insecticides work because if you get it in contact with that beetle, it will kill it. The trick is going to be actually getting the insecticide to contact that beetle. That's very difficult because, again, once they get inside that tree, they're almost unreachable. So now scales are another common urban insect we see, and that's, we're not going to belabor the scales point. There's a lot of different scales. There's these soft scales. These excrete honeydew. That's the stuff, if you are unfortunate enough to park underneath a tree that's full of scales, you will have sticky droplets all over your car and windshield at the end of the day. So soft scales produce those. These hard armored scales, this pine scale is fairly common. These actually don't produce honeydew. So there's many different kinds. There's also these licanium scales that they make honeydew, and then there's some of these wax scales as well. So there's all sorts of different types of scales. It's going to be very important to figure out, if you've got a scale issue, to figure out what kind of scale you have, not just this general group, but if you can, figure out what the species is, because that is going to help you know how to treat them. And we'll talk about one scale in particular, the Crepe Myrtle bark scale. This is a native to Asia, so another one of our non-native woody pests. It produces honeydew, which then drips down the tree and makes this dark black stuff called sooty mold. So as the honeydew seeps down the tree, the mold, this black fungus grows on it, and you get this charred appearance on these things. It does cause stunted growth, dieback, and especially the aesthetics are really rough on some of these things, because you'll have these trees like this. You've got the white scales all over, you've got black trunks, and it just looks really, really ratty. To some, that may not be a big deal, but if you've got a bunch of these crepe myrtles on the city square, for instance, or at a golf course, that type of thing, where aesthetics are more important, then it is a big deal, and control is very important. And this just shows you the importance of treatment. This tree on the left has been treated with chemical to keep those away. You can see how many flowers and how good that looks. The tree on the right looks okay. It has not been treated, but you can see there's many, many, many less flowers on this tree. So clearly these insects have a little bit of an impact. It may not kill the tree, but it's going to reduce the flowering for sure and give that tree a little extra stress. Crepe myrtle bark scale is fortunately not completely widespread in the region. It's found in 11 states, but it's fairly patchy in its distribution, so it's not something I would call widespread. It's especially worse in this western Gulf region of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana, though there are spots going over here into the eastern part of the region as well. How do you control scales? Man, there's all sorts of different ways to control scales. There's insecticides, there's horticultural oils and soaps, growth regulators. In the end, the best method is going to depend on what particular scale insect you have. That's why it's going to be important to figure out what you've got, take pictures, take samples, go back, figure out what are you dealing with, and then that will help you determine what to use. Okay, the spotted lanternfly is one of our newest invasives to the southeast. Now, if you're joining us from Pennsylvania, you know it's not a new invasive and you're familiar, but us Southeasterners, we're still learning about this thing. It's a potentially very major pest of fruit trees and vines, any hardwood really, and that's why it's in here. This thing will feed on basically any hardwood tree species you can think of. It was first found in Pennsylvania in 2014. It's a very striking beetle. Here it is on the tip of my finger. So it is large. It is at least about a ½ inch long. The nymphs are black with bright red and white spots on them. They're very easy to see. As we mentioned before, the adults have this bright red underwing, so when they fly, you'll see these flashes of red. Here's where we're looking at right now as far as where is the spotted lanternfly. Right down here around southeastern Pennsylvania, Lancaster. That was your ground zero. In 2018, we found dead ones here in Delaware and this part of New York. We found a live infestation earlier this year in Virginia, and as of very recently, there were 2 more live infestations in New York, one over here in the Finger Lakes by Ithaca, and one over here by Albany. So it seems fairly obvious, at least to me anyway, that this thing is moving, and it's a very difficult one to control because the eggs look like gray silly putty pushed onto a rock or onto a piece of bark. They're very difficult to see, these egg masses. The adults and the nymphs, you know, those are brightly colored. Those are large, those are fairly easy to see, but these egg masses are very difficult to see, and for some reason they seem to like laying their eggs on rocks. So you get somewhere with a rock quarry that's nearby a group of these spotted lanternflies, and they can be moved quite a bit. But as far as the life cycle, the adults can be seen, you know, in midsummer. Nymphs have 4 instars. That first they start out as these little black ones. They get a little bit bigger, and then the adults, and then they'll lay their eggs again. Now this bug does have a strong preference for tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, which is a non-native species, an invasive species, and I know what some of you are thinking. Yay, something that eats tree of heaven. Well, the good news is, yes, it eats tree of heaven, and so it may provide a little control for that particular tree, but the bad news is there are so many tree of heaven out here that it's probably not going to do any good. And even worse, the other things it feeds on are what we really care about. The vines, the other hardwood trees, the fruit trees. All of those things are susceptible hosts. There's plenty of data from Pennsylvania that shows the negative impact these things have on the vine industry. And if you like wine, that's an impact on the wine industry. And then the fruit trees as well. The Pennsylvania Department of Ag and Penn State Extension have a great extension program for spotted lanternfly. So that's kind of the go-to source there. Again, this is one that, as far as the Southeast is concerned, it's only found so far in South Carolina, but it's something we really need to be vigilant about and keep an eye out for. And one good thing is because they love tree of heaven so much, and this is a whole bunch of them sucking the juice out of one of these trees, there's been strategies used where you cut down all the tree of heaven in an area except for one, and then you leave that one, and all these insects will go to that one tree. Then you can come through and you can inject that tree with pesticide, and you will kill hundreds, if not thousands, of spotted lanternflies in one fell swoop. Is this method going to be useful to eliminate spotted lanternfly? No, it's not, but it can provide a bit of, it'll help us manage the populations a little bit better. So now we'll talk about butt and root rots, and there are many different species of butt and root rots for trees in urban areas, Ganoderma, Innotinus, Armillaria, all these things. Pretty much all of these fungi are something you see after the damage has been done. These are not primary tree killers. They can take years by their own to kill a tree. In some cases, they may kill a tree for decades. They're easy to see, though. You can see these big conchs on the base of trees. Here's a few in Georgia, and this is elsewhere in the Southeast. Any decay at the base of a living tree is a potential colonizing spot. You can see here, this is a big decayed area. You've got these things living here and feeding on that tissue. The only control really is prevention. Good tree care practices are going to help you avoid getting butt and root rots. Avoiding mechanical injury, and in urban areas, you're looking at lawnmowers and you're looking at weed eater blight, right? Getting the base of that tree hit with a weed eater string and opening up those wounds. That is the biggest, one of the biggest ways that these things get started, is this mechanical injury. And as far as what is the problem with butt and root rots, well, it basically turns trees into hazard trees, because these fungi are growing on dead tissue at the base of the tree, dead tissue in the coarse roots. And if those coarse roots happen to fail, you will have a tree tip over, and it becomes a liability issue. I'll give you a little example. This is one of the streets in the town I live. You can see I've got three trees in front here. These two on the right and left are big, green, and healthy, and I've got this little tree right here in the middle, planted the same size. It is smaller in every way, shape, or form, with a much reduced canopy crown. And when you look there, there's these conchs, and I've been watching this tree for 3 years now. There's been conchs every year. Last year it was one conch. This year, it went from one conch to 2 conchs to 3 conchs right now. Now, we've done some science on these butt and root rots, especially the Ganoderma fungi, and what we know so far is that these organisms feed on dead tissue. They do not seem to cause dead tissue. They feed on dead tissue. There's still research ongoing, but the best knowledge we have right now is that these bud and root rots are feeding on tissues that have been killed by something else, or because that tree has been weakened. So that's why we We continue to encourage people to keep trees healthy, go with your standard ISA practices as far as tree care and all that type of thing, and that will help you avoid a lot of these problems. Now, people may have noticed I did not speak at all on palm tree diseases or insects. That's because I just am not an expert in that, and there are people much more qualified than I, especially at the University of Florida. They have a palm problems key, which is, you could talk for hours on palm disease itself. So if you're in an area with palm issues, this particular slide was from Dr. Carrie Harmon down there at the Plant Diagnostic Center. She's a great resource and a great person. She'd probably be happy to take your calls, but start here with this plant problems key. That is a great one. So what can you do to protect your trees from insects and fungi in the urban area? Well, you promote good tree care and silviculture. This is very standard stuff we tell people, and we talk to homeowners a lot too. Homeowners will spend hours every weekend tending a flower garden, but then they will plant a tree and not do anything to it for 30 years and just expect it to grow and flourish. Trees are plants too. Trees can use a little help now and then, even if it's just every year you give it a little fertilizer or you water it if it gets dry. That's all we ask people to do, and that's something you can ask your clients to do too, is just take care of your tree like you'd take care of any other plant in your yard. Putting the right tree on the right site. There's a reason certain trees are planted very commonly in urban areas, and it's because they can handle stress. And there's a reason certain trees are not planted in urban areas, is because they're a little more sensitive to things. So if you're going to put a tree that's extremely sensitive to drought and high temperatures in the middle of a parking lot, you're probably going to have problems from the get-go. So the right tree on the right side is very important. Making sure that tree has adequate resources. Again, if it's dry, it's going to need to be watered. If it needs fertilizer once a year, it's not that big a deal, hopefully, and hopefully that can be accomplished. And again, minimizing damage, both physical and chemical. There's a lot of damage that happens when people want to keep their yards good manicured. A lot of those pesticides and over-fertilization can negatively impact trees. That's something we see quite a bit as well. And at the end of the day, just follow your ISA and SAF standard protocols. It's all about keeping trees healthy. And again, with the exception of very few of these insects, emerald ash borer, that type of thing will attack a live tree. Most of the things we talked about today are simply going to hit trees that are stressed already. With that, I am finished, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks, Dave. That was a great overview on some southeastern forest pests and some of the butt rots that you covered there. So I'm going to share my slides. Okay. Sorry, guys. Hold on one second. So Dave, as I'm getting my slides up here, we had one question. Are you going to be able to make your slides available for reference? I can send it out to everyone.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. You want me to make them as a PDF?
That'd be great.
Yep, happy to do that.
Okay, everyone, we only have time for a few questions, but if you could type questions in the Q&A box, if you have some. Again, we'll only have time for a few of them, but as you're doing that, I'm going to go over what's on this last slide. Can you see that, Dave?
Yes.
Okay, so again, our speaker today was Dr. Dave Coyle. He's an assistant professor at Clemson University. His email address is on the slide here. If you have any questions, he welcomes those questions. Today's webinar is going to be archived. So we're recording today's webinar. It'll be archived, or it'll be listed as on demand on the link that you got to this webinar at. So it's on foresterywebinars.net. And I should have that up and ready to view if you want to pass it on to anyone else or watch it again in a couple of days. So as mentioned earlier in the webinar, this webinar is part of a series. This is number 11 in our 12-part series, so we have one more to go. And that series is another sort of southeastern focused forest health for urban trees. So leaf spots, scorches, and wilts affecting southeastern U.S. deciduous trees, and that's going to be presented by Dr. Jean Williams-Woodward of University of Georgia on October 25th. So you can find out more information about that, again, at the webinar portal at forestrywebinars.net. If you have any questions about the webinar series, I would love to take them. My email address is here, hollycam@uga.edu, or you can go to our website at sref.info and get more information about the series. On our homepage, we have a link there for the entire series. So this webinar is available for ISA and SAF credits. There is a short quiz that you'll need to complete prior to getting those credits. And so if you want to stay for the Q&A, we highly encourage that. Or if you want to go ahead and finish that quiz and get your credits, we understand that as well. There's also a short satisfaction survey that we would love if you guys can take after the webinar. Okay, Dave, I'm going to take a couple of these. We answered some of them.
I've been trying to get to a couple in the chat box as well. One was, do we know how spotted lanternfly got here? I am not aware that we know that. I mean, we suspect it came in on some sort of cargo is probably what happened. Those egg masses are extremely difficult to, and you know, that's the odds. I don't know that we will ever really know how it got here. So we could only speculate. So we don't know. But it's here now, and that's where we're at.
Okay, so I'm not a forest health person. Turpentine beetles, are those in the southeast, Dave? We got a question about that. Okay, so the question was, what can you tell me about treating black turpentine beetle infestations? For example, what do you do? When do you do it?
Turpentine beetles are another one of our native bark beetles. You know, in the deep south here, we mostly just have black turpentine beetle, but they have red turpentine beetle as well when you get up into the mountains and the northern areas of the country. They are not aggressive beetles. They're sort of like Gyps. They will pick off the old and the weak. So if you have turpentine beetles, the odds are your tree is stressed for some reason. A tree can survive a few turpentine beetle attacks, believe it or not. It's not like Gyps and southern pine beetle where your tree is, really, really hurting. Turpentine beetles, a tree can survive those. There are some, you know, topical insecticides you can put on to try to control them. I rarely advise people to chemically treat because I guess at this point I have not really seen a case where chemical treatment was necessary. Now, theoretically, if you've got, you know, something happening and there's a whole bunch of turpentine beetles going, on one hand, you could spray topical chemicals on there, or you could try to inject the tree if it's a super high value one. But if that was the case and someone came to me with that situation, I would almost suggest, well, let's back up and say, what's going on with these trees to where they're weak enough to be getting turpentine beetle spots in the beginning? So, you know, it's a phloem feeder. So basically any type of treatment that gets some chemical into the phloem will be effective. But I think for turpentine beetles especially, it's important to figure out why are they attacking in the first place, because they're not something that's normally very aggressive.
Excellent. So we have a participant from California, and obviously you're talking just about southeastern U.S. pests, but they said, are any of the species mentioned today in California are getting close? It looks like EAB is getting close.
EAB is, you know, there's a spot in Colorado. That's about as close as it is to California. California, you've got your own set of issues out there. There's a number of, you know, palm pests out there and some other things. Let me think. I think everything else I talked about today, there's crepe myrtle bark scale in New Mexico, I believe. But other than that, everything I talked about is, for the most part, Eastern North America. So there's a really good urban group with UC, what is he with? I can't think of his name. I can dig that up and try to find that. But the UC system has a couple of really good people. Mark Hoddle is his name, Hoddle. And he does a lot of the urban tree pest stuff in California. So I would strongly suggest that would be your best source of information for that part of the world. Mark Hoddle.
Okay, so we're just going to do one last one because we're almost at the end of our time here. And I'm going to combine two questions because they're both about EAB. So as far as treating EAB, the proverbial response for treatment is to start when EAB is within 15 miles of you. The problem is most people are not monitoring with traps, trap trees, or branch sampling. How do you know it is 15 miles away if no one's monitoring? How does the homeowner or the city arborist know that?
Yeah, that's a tricky one if they're not monitoring. We rely on both the USDA APHIS and in the Southeast, all the states have an EAB monitoring program. So we rely on them, and they've got a pretty good network of traps. Did this question say where this person was from?
No, I don't believe so.
Yeah, that's if there's no monitoring going on, I would almost suspect you're in a spot that isn't very close to EAB, because I think everywhere there's EAB, there's monitoring happening at this point. If nothing else, to figure out where it is and where it's going. I guess that's the best I can do with that one. It seems like if there's no monitoring, you're either in a spot where EAB is completely already moved through and it's everywhere, in which case they will stop the monitoring sometimes. If you're anywhere along the edge of where EAB is or is going, I think there's a fairly decent trapping system set up. So if you're in an area without any monitoring, my hunch is you're not close enough to EAB to probably be worrying about it yet. Now, obviously, if stuff came in, in a load of firewood, that's a completely different ballgame. But as far as the natural spread.
Great, thanks. Dr. Coyle, did you have anything else you wanted to share before we close out?
There's a lot of good. There's some folks putting in some spotted lanternfly links in the comments here. Thanks for putting those in. I think a lot of links in there. These are all great links and great people. There's a lot available online. If you have pests, there's a lot of us out there that are willing to help. So we are happy to do so. So feel free to reach out if anything comes up for everybody.
Okay, and with mentioning that, I'll leave the webinar up briefly. I'll have the sound turn off after I close out, but if anyone wants to copy and paste some of the links that are in the chat box, you can do that. All right, thanks everyone so much for joining the webinar today, and thanks again, Dave, for giving us an outstanding webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks everyone for being here.
Okay, everyone have a great day.